Hi, welcome to Chapter 4. In this chapter, we'll discuss classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, we start with the unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that naturally elicits a biological reflex. So in Pavlov's original experiment, he had canines that were administered food, and when the food was placed in the canine's mouth, it elicited this unlearned innate biological reflex of salivation. And so just like you or I, if we have the introduction of food into the mouth, we have this natural response of salivation, which helps us to swallow and digest our food. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, and so he was initially interested in this basic biological process of salivation and digestion. It was only accidentally that he discovered what he called psychic reflexes, or the conditional response. And so with classical conditioning, we have a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is any stimulus that does not elicit a biological reflex action. So with Pavlov's study, we have an auditory stimulus, the sound of a metronome, the ring of a bell, that previously elicited no response, but it is repeatedly paired with our unconditioned stimulus. So we have the presentation of the auditory stimulus coinciding with the presentation of our unconditioned stimulus, the food, and after repeated pairings, an association is learned, and we produce a conditioned response. So this previously neutral stimulus becomes our conditioned stimulus. And so this conditioned response is not something that is biological or innate. It's the result of experience. So the repeated experience of the bell paired with the food elicits this conditioned response. So it's important to recognize that our conditioned response on the surface appears identical to the unconditioned response. So in each instance, we have salivation. What distinguishes these two responses is the timing in the eliciting stimulus. So salivating in response to the food is natural and biological. Salivating in response to an auditory stimulus is not. That requires experience and learning. So the eliciting stimulus is key, and also the timing. Salivating prior to receiving the food or in absence of receiving the food requires experience, and is a learned response. With classical conditioning, timing and consistency or contingency are key. If we have a long delay between the presentation of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, we may impair learning. So with our aversive conditioning of the eye blink response, imagine if the auditory stimulus, the sound of the metronome, occurred 2 hours prior to the introduction of the puff of air. It may be incredibly difficult to learn that conditioned eye blink response to that auditory stimulus. Imagine all the times that we blink in that 2-hour span that separates the two stimuli. And so we need this contiguity of presentation. So a short time interval between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, or ideally a simultaneous presentation of the two. Contingency is also key. So the consistency with which the two are paired together. Imagine if Pavlov rang the bell, but only occasionally administered the food afterwards. So Our dogs may have a difficult time pairing those two together. They may find that the bell is only an unreliable predictor or not a consistent predictor of the presentation of the food. And so we don't see a reliable or consistent association formed, and we don't see a consistent condition response. The importance of consistency or contiguity or contingency, is apparent when we observe latent inhibition effects. Here, the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented in isolation. So imagine that Pavlov rings the bell repeatedly for no reason. Then the conditioned stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So now Pavlov pairs the bell with the food. If this occurs, learning is disrupted. The dogs will have difficulty producing a conditioned response to the bell. During the early presentations of the bell, it didn't predict anything. So at best, it's an unreliable predictor of food, or worse, it has been completely ignored by the time it is presented with the food. Think about our last chapter when we discussed habituation and the idea that stimuli that are repeatedly presented that have no personal relevance or impact on us are often ignored. And so with this repeated presentation of the bell in isolation, our dogs may habituate, or a subject may habituate to this stimulus and ignore it, disrupting that subject's ability to associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus when they're paired to produce a conditioned response. So these early experiences with the stimulus are inhibiting the subject's ability to change that stimulus to a conditioned stimulus and elicit a conditioned response. With blocking, again, we find that the nature of our experiences and potentially cognitions can impact conditioning. So our blocking experiment is a little complex. So let's break it down a bit. In the control condition, we have two neutral stimuli, a bell and a light, that are repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus and electric shock. Our auditory and visual cues are simultaneously presented in conjunction with the unconditioned stimulus during the learning trials. In the test trial, only one of the stimuli is presented. Because we are using an aversive, painful, unconditioned stimulus, we would expect some type of avoidance response, such as freezing. The question is, will the light elicit this response in isolation without the bell? So we had it in our learning trials, a compound stimulus. So we had the bell with the light. So will the light produce a conditioned response in isolation? Researchers found that this was the case, although it's not as strong as when the bell and the light are presented together, but still our subject is learning that the visual stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus, and we see a conditioned response of freezing. Keep in mind that cats weren't used in this study. I just thought that they were fun for our example. In the experimental condition, we have the bell repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus. After several learning trials, researchers added the compound stimulus. So now the bell and the light are paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Then the test trial is the same as in the control condition. The light is presented in isolation. Now we see that the light in isolation fails to elicit the conditioned response. The initial trials with the bell by itself blocked the light from becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus. It's as though the subject has learned that the bell is a reliable predictor of the unconditioned stimulus, and the later addition of the light adds no value for prediction. And so it's disregarded or ignored. These inhibition and blocking effects challenge the core behaviorist movement. The behaviorists argued that underlying mental activity and cognition were not essential to produce or explain conditioned responses. The strict behaviorists went so far as to claim that these cognitions were non-existent. However, the inhibition and blocking effects suggest that cognitive processes such as attention and memory are needed to account for conditioning effects. John Watson, a strict behaviorist, wanted to demonstrate that all responses, even emotions, were conditioned responses. Along with his student Rosalie Rayner, he conducted the Little Albert case study. Albert was a young child from the Johns Hopkins University nursery. As a calm, docile child, he had few natural fears. The one thing he was afraid of was loud noises. And so Watson's basic experimental setup was something like this. We have our young child, little Albert, who undergoes classical conditioning, in which John Watson would use the unconditioned stimulus of a loud noise. He would actually bang a gong right behind little Albert's head to scare him, and would simultaneously present what was previously a neutral stimulus, the white rat, would present the white rat, the loud noise repeatedly until he was able to elicit a conditioned fear response, a fear response to the white rat by itself. And so little Albert would display avoidance or freezing behavior, attempt to escape the white rat. And this generalized to other similar stimuli. Often people ask what happened to little Albert after the study. Albert was the son of a nurse who worked at the campus hospital here at Johns Hopkins. And to our knowledge, he was never deconditioned. And so it seems as though this may be problematic. So people were interested in what happened. Was he always afraid of white rats for his whole life? Unfortunately, the story ends rather tragically. Little Albert died at the age of 6, not anything to do with the experiment, but he died of acquired hydrocephalus. It's unfortunate that little Albert was not deconditioned, because extinguishing a conditioned response is important for understanding the practical applications of classical conditioning, particularly in a therapeutic setting. If we know that fears can be conditioned, we can use basic principles of conditioning to eliminate or treat these fears. We can break the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus by repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus in isolation. John Watson could repeatedly present the white rat without the loud noise until little Albert learned that the rat was nothing to fear. Again, we see the role of contingency and extinction. The conditioned stimulus no longer reliably predicts the unconditioned stimulus. So how is this used in therapy? People with fears or phobias may seek systematic desensitization therapy. With the help of a therapist, they create a fear hierarchy. For example, I'm afraid of the giant water roaches here in Texas. I might list standing next to a completely dead roach as low on my fear hierarchy and holding a live roach in my hand as high on my fear hierarchy. And so with the help of a therapist, I would progressively move up my hierarchy. And at each stage, encountering the stimulus and attempting to maintain a relaxed state. And so I have repeated encounters with the feared stimulus without negative consequences, till the point when I am able to reach the top of my hierarchy and encounter this stimulus without a fear response. And so that fear response is now extinct. And so you might try this out on your own. You might think of ways that you could encounter your feared stimulus. and progressively work up through some stages. Now, be very careful. This may not be practical depending on what your fear is. But for something like mine, I could attempt to do this on my own, and I have tried, walking past dead roaches and trying to stay calm. I haven't really progressed much through any type of hierarchy. I definitely can't hold a live roach. So I haven't been very successful, but maybe some of you guys have tried something similar and have experienced more success. Following the Little Albert study, it was discovered that Watson was having an extramarital affair with his graduate student, Rosalie Renner. As a result, Watson was forced to leave the university in disgrace and ultimately pursued a career in advertising. We can definitely see the influence of classical conditioning on marketing and advertising. Many advertising campaigns are built around associating products with bright colors, happy people, pleasant music, etc. Coca-Cola has even managed to pair their product with Christmas and Santa in the hopes that those positive holiday emotions will transfer to their product or become associated with their product after repeated pairings. We know that they have been wildly successful. They sell syrup water all over the world. While classical conditioning can't completely account for their success, it's clear that they've tapped into some core psychology in their marketing. And maybe you can think of other examples of ads that rely on classical conditioning, or maybe other examples of classical conditioning in your own personal life. Maybe certain stimuli that you're drawn to or have an emotional response to. You can trace that emotion or that particular response back to some experience that indicates classical conditioning. So for instance, I have a positive emotional response to the smell of sunscreen, and I really like that smell. And I think that it has to do with the association that that smell has with positive experiences in my past. And so that scent in particular is paired with fun summer activities with friends and family, going to the park, going to the pool or the beach. And so all of those positive emotions that are associated with those activities and those memories are associated now with that scent. And so that scent is able to elicit those positive emotions through this process of classical conditioning. So let us know if you have any similar examples. And we'll talk more about some of the challenges to classic behaviors here and expand on some of the real-world applications of classical conditioning in the next video.